Welcome back. We just finished talking about defining a species. What is a species? How do we name species? And now we are going to talk about how things become species, right? How did we get the diversity that we see today on Earth, starting with just one species? How does that happen? So let's get into it here. Speciation. Won't let me go through. We're going to have to start at the beginning. Um, get through. Okay. So remember, we had this biological species concept that was based on reproductive isolation. And that's still a key part that we're thinking of here when we talk about how things become species. The first is reproductive isolation. So whether it's because they're physically separated or just don't mate with each other, if you have species mating back and forth, if you've got migration, if they've got gene flow, they can't have enough DNA differences to speciate. So the very first thing is organisms have to stop mating with each other. That's easy for bacteria because they never mated, right? Um, but for animals, it's harder. You're going to have to physically separate them, right? Once organisms are no longer mating, then you need some diversity to build up, some genetic divergence. They need to be different from one another. That can be mutations or enough selection that they are different from one another, right? Or a founder effect, some small group goes off on its own, and then there could be some selection and mutations that build up. So when organisms are physically separated, this is called allopatric speciation. So um, allo, I'm trying to draw here, allo means other, and patric is country, right? Like patriotic. So this is organisms that live in a different country from one another. They are geographically separated. This could be you've got one population that gets divided by an earthquake or a crater, right? Or some individuals go and move to the other side of the mountain, right? So they're divided. Um, and so we've got our original population here. Somehow they get divided. Now they can't meet with one another. Over time, either due to genetic drift, which is just by chance, one population ends up, drifting one way. They lose some genes or some alleles and become one way. Another population becomes another, or there could be selection, right? They one needs to be faster or a better swimmer, or to eat a different kind of food, or to be a different color, right? So differences build up over time when they're isolated, and they're not mixing, right? If they could hybridize and mix and migrate, there wouldn't be differences between the populations, but they can't. So these differences build up enough that over time, if they were then brought back together, right? Let's say a river divided them and that river dries up. They could now run back and forth across that dry riverbed, but they don't recognize each other as the same species. They won't mate or they can't mate. So this is an easy way to picture speciation, right? You've got one species, it gets divided, and they change enough from one another that when they come back together, they're not the same species. Now, another type of speciation is sympatric. They're the um, same country, sympatric. Okay, this is a harder one to think about because for animals, if they're living in the same place, they're probably going to mate with each other. So this is rare in animals, but it's more common in plants. Plants, sometimes when their gametes are forming, they don't go through meiosis properly, and instead of being haploid with one copy of each chromosome, they have two. So then their offspring are going to have the wrong number of chromosomes. So if a 2N plant mates with itself, which they can do, some plants can, their offspring ends up being 4N instead of 2N, right? You had a 2N egg and a 2N sperm, and you've got a 4N baby out of that. Now, this 4N offspring cannot go mate with its parents or any of the same species of its parents, but it can mate with itself. So in one generation, suddenly we have a whole new species that's reproductively isolated. So plants can do some funky things that animals can't, and they can have sympatric speciation. Right, so now it's reproductively isolated. So when we're looking at these species, we can draw trees, which you have probably seen, not even really thinking of it like that, right? If you've ever seen something that looks like this, right? This is a phylogenetic tree, right? Everywhere I'm putting a letter here, these are different species. And when we're looking at this, because A and B are sharing this little small bracket, they're more closely related to each other than they are to C and D, which are sharing a bracket, right? And A, B, C, and D are more closely related to each other because they share this bracket, this that I'm outlining thicker here now, right? So A, B, C, and D are more closely related to one another than they are to E, which is way out here, right? So this shows us a timeline and an evolutionary history and relationships among species. So just a little bit of terminology here. This classification of these species, not by naming them, the Linnaean system, but by looking at who's more closely related to whom and who their ancestors are. This process is called systematics. It's just, we've got a system for who's related to whom and their history. This tree of relationships is called a phylogeny. It's like a family tree. So this phylogeny is a hypothesis. It is our best guess of the relationships among species. And they can be changed, right? We get more DNA data, we may change our phylogeny. So if I'm gonna get a blank whiteboard here. So when I say like this is a hypothesis of relationships and of history, the reason is if we are drawing it, if we think of this as a timeline, right? So on the far left is the past, and as we move forward over here, this is going to be the present, okay? So in the past, we started with one species, okay? Then let's say there was an event that those individuals got separated from one another, right? We have allopatric speciation occurring and differences built up. We ended up now, we've got two populations that are different from one another. Okay, and here, this one has some changes building up over time. Maybe this one doesn't change, right? And then this one could change again, right? So everywhere where we see, oops, I'm just looking for another color. Okay, everywhere we see this, like a fork in the road, that's a species, this is a common ancestor that they had, right? So this is an ancestor. It went from here, from the back, right to here. This was an ancestor. And then as we move along here, these are changes building up all over time. Right here, we've got another fork in the road. This was the common ancestor. So if we go to the, like if we label these again, A, B, C, D, and E, A and B shared an ancestor at this point here, where I'm putting that circle, that node, that fork in the road. That's where they had a common ancestor. And then enough changes built up that now they're two different species, right? C and D shared an ancestor here, and A, B, C, and D all shared an ancestor here where I'm making it orange, okay? There was one species at that point, and it is now four. And we can see time here, right? So this is our timeline, and we can see that these shared a common ancestor, A and B shared a common ancestor at this point in time, but A, B, C, and D shared one at this point in time, so that would be older, right? So we can really get an idea. This is a hypothesis of how things happened. And again, it could be wrong. Maybe we'll get new data. Maybe there's another species that needs to come in here, right, and split off. Or maybe it turns out that we sequence the entire genome of A and B and they're not as close as we think, or something else, right? So this is a hypothesis, but this is building an evolutionary tree of what we think the relationships are. All right, let's go back to our lecture notes here. Okay, so what we're going to do now is just look at, here's a tree. And this is making a tree based on some physical characteristics, not DNA evidence. So this is actually how some species are like classified at a very broad level. Does it have vertebrae? You know, if yes, then it, you know, we have to look at more things. If no, but it's a, you know, some sort of if it's an animal that meets some certain characteristics, but it doesn't have a vertebra, then it's a lancelet. If it does, then we need to look, okay, well, its mouth, does it have a hinged jaw? If it doesn't, then it's a lamprey. That's a vertebrate without a hinged jaw. But if it does, then we need to ask some more questions. Okay, does it have legs? If it doesn't, then it's a fish. Those are the only, you know, that's our option. But if it does have legs, we need to ask some more questions. Okay, the kind of eggs that it lays, does it have an amniotic sac? If it doesn't, it's a frog. And if it does, we need to ask more questions. Does it have hair? If it doesn't, it's a reptile. And if it does, in this case, it's a rabbit. There are a lot of, obviously could be any mammal based on that, but this just shows how some of this classification is done. And we talked a little bit already when we were talking about evolution, about traits that are homologous due to shared ancestry and traits that are analogous due to convergent evolution. So when you're building a tree like this, you need to be sure that you're doing something that's based on homology, based on a shared ancestry, right? Does it have, you know, when we're looking at this, all of these traits actually are based on shared ancestry. Hair, all mammals have it because our ancestor had it. The amniotic sac, yes, all land vertebrates except for frogs have that because our ancestor had it, right? So these are homologous traits. But we have to make sure not to use analogous traits like wings, because birds and bats and insects all have that. So some of this just requires luck, some requires knowledge to know what traits to use when you're building a tree. Because these analogous traits could mess you up, right? They're due to natural selection. So you may say, oh, well, the bats and the, you know, the cat and the butterflies are closely related because they both fly. Obviously, that would be a really bad way to make your tree, to put bats away from all other mammals and stick them with the insects. So using DNA tends to be more accurate based on than like looking at morphology for building trees. So we can look at this, and this is just a very small section of 6 base pairs of DNA, and you can look at this, and just looking at this, which species would you group together as being more closely related than the others, right? So they've even highlighted it for you. If the outgroup is a relative, so like when we were when I was drawing those other trees, if we say we've got, let's say, 2 groups and we've got an outgroup here, right? So for this, I would put 1 and 2 are closely related. They both share that. They've changed from what the outgroup has. 3 and 4 are more closely related. And then we have our outgroup, which I'll just call O here, right? Is related. It shares some traits, but it hasn't made some of these other changes. So this would be what this tree looks like. And this term monophyletic group, that is an ancestor and all its descendants. And so it depends how far back you want to go. If you're looking right here, where I'm putting a dot, that's a monophyletic group that includes species 1 and 2. If you want to go back to here, this monophyletic group is species 1, 2, 3, and 4. Or you could go all the way back to where they all shared a common ancestor, and we now have this outgroup plus these groups. So it's just a group that has one lineage, right? We're looking at one lineage. Mono is one, phyletic is a phylogeny, one, the line of ancestry. Okay, and I think we will stop here and then we will talk a little bit more about big picture evolution when we return.